Welcome to this hour of virtual retreat and reflection for all the old boys and old girls, old Ampleforthians who are here with us this weekend. It's very good to know that you are with us. I am Father Christopher. In recent years, I've come to appreciate the work of Richard Rohr, an American Franciscan, and have decided to base this retreat on some of his insights of a few weeks ago on order, disorder, and reorder. The relevance of these will emerge as we go forward. Based on the home retreat experience some of us have been involved in, there will be 3 10-minute talks on these themes, followed by a period of reflection and ending with some concluding remarks. The first of them is on order. Richard began his reflections as follows. It seems quite clear that we grow by passing beyond some perfect order through an often painful and seemingly unnecessary disorder to an enlightened reorder or resurrection. This is the universal pattern that connects and solidifies our relationships with everything around us. The trajectory of transformation and growth, as I see the great religious and philosophical traditions charting it, uses many metaphors for this pattern. To grow towards love, union, salvation, or enlightenment, we must be moved from order to disorder and then ultimately to reorder. A sense of order is the easiest and most natural way to begin. It is a needed first container or structure to contain an ordered existence. I cannot think of a culture in human history before the present postmodern era that did not value law, tradition, custom, family loyalties, authority, boundaries, and morality of some clear sort. While they aren't perfect, these containers, they give us the necessary security, predictability, impulse control, and ego structure that we need before the chaos of real life shows up. As far as I can see it, healthy, conservative people tend to grow up more naturally and more happily than those who receive only free-form, build-it-yourself worldviews from their parents and teachers. Rather than talk in too general terms, I want to speak of a semi-hypothetical situation, but use some of my own experience to illustrate this first half of life journey and the building of a first container. For my own part, I emerged from a fairly strong post-war container. Although I was born abroad, it was in part of the British Empire, albeit one which was about to gain its independence. So we are all born into a period of history in our own or some other culture, which had its own peculiar character. My father was strong yet gentle. My mother was physically weak from polio, but still quite a strong character. My father had employment. My mother had some independent means. And we were not rich by today's standards, but very comfortable. Thanks to savings and investment, we were able to obtain quite a substantial property when my parents returned to England, and I was sent to a public school. I was baptized into the Roman Catholic Church shortly after birth, and brought up a Roman Catholic, at least to the extent of weekly Mass and monthly confession, and the public school was Roman Catholic and run by monks. I was at that school, Gilling Castle and Ampleforth College, from 1955 to 1965. So this gives you something of the style of my parents' container from which I emerged as a young man. However, bear in mind that the container my parents built was itself part of a reordering after the Second World War. So the patterns that we follow are all interconnected and overlapping with patterns in society and between generations. There are three very basic questions which we answer for the first half of life task when we leave home. Who am I and what makes me significant? How do I support myself? Who will accompany me? These are significant questions, and setting about answering them takes a lot of energy and planning, and they can become so absorbing that this journey and its completion may appear to be the only journey for one's whole life. Each of us will have our own story and answer to each of these three questions. For my own part, I wanted to be a monk. After a false start, advised by parents and other relatives, which took me to begin work in industry and the possibility of university as a chemical engineer, I joined the novitiate in 1967 at Ampleforth, under the abbacy of Basil Hume. My three basic questions were answered as follows. I would be a monk of Ampleforth with a new name. I would work for the community to help support it, and I would be accompanied by my brethren. The meaning of each of these answers would change and deepen over time and be influenced by other patterns which were emerging in society and in church. But basically, this was the ordered start which I hoped for at the beginning of the first journey. You yourselves will have your own ordered start in life, building your container, as Richard Rohr calls it in his book Falling Upwards. However, let me mention a few variables. We also begin our journey at a particular time in history, in relation with our God and our church, if we are believers, and from the particular ordered or disordered lifestyle that our parents had. These things will all influence our start and the sort of order we are able to establish at the beginning. Again, for my own part, society was going through the crazy 60s and 70s, the challenge to authority, the sexual revolution, the self-expression in clothing, hairstyle, rock and roll music, student protests, flower power, and CND. These elements had not yet penetrated the monastery, but they would. At the same time, the church bishops had convened in an ecumenical council, Vatican II, and this revolution did penetrate the monastery, though Basil Hume tried his best to bring the changes in slowly and in an ordered fashion. Both these influences outside were forms of disorder which assailed the quiet conservative order within the monastery. The emphasis for me was the church disorder, but for many of you it will have been the changes in society, in particular the sexual revolution and the challenge to authority. Younger Old Ampleforthians will have different experiences and influences from their own era, including the present. If we are honest, all change involves the pattern of order, disorder, and reordering. If you change your course at university or change your job, this pattern is followed. But most change takes place within an ordered framework. It is only when the framework itself is being shaken that your personal establishment of order is also shaken, and you may be precipitated into the second stage of crisis or disorder. We will look at this stage in a few minutes, but first, let us reflect. The second talk on disorder. In reflecting upon the order we each tried to establish in our lives when we started out from home, we probably realized that disorder kept creeping in one way or another. We may simply have failed to get to our chosen university when we left school, or even failed to get to university at all, or failed to get the required exams to follow our chosen career. Adjustments needed to be made to our plans. These may have caused mini crises, but essentially we continued to adapt, regroup, and proceed in our chosen direction of travel. The same may have occurred in our relationships, our financial arrangements, our health, and countless other areas of our life. Essentially, however, we continued in our own reasonably ordered first journey of life. We may even have survived or dodged disruptive elements or tendencies in our society or in our church life. A few examples. In my own chosen path, and less than a year after I entered the monastery, we suddenly began to establish a new and English version of the office, the recited or sung prayer of the monks in choir, 5 times a day. For some, this may have been a drastic change from a very fixed Latin office which seemed to have been prayed for centuries. For myself, I knew nothing very different, and the new order seemed better in many respects. Whatever the experience of the brethren, office continued to be an essential part of our life, but some felt that the church was going through a period of disorder. On the other hand, disorder can strike from several directions at once, as it did when I went to Zimbabwe after 16 years teaching in the school, first at Gilling and later as housemaster of St Oswald's. Although it was my first visit to Africa, I was not unused to foreign countries, and our monastic life at Christ the Word, though different in many respects, was essentially the same pattern of prayer and work and community life. However, there were massive political and economic changes following the farm invasions. Community life was difficult and stressful. The particular conditions in Zimbabwe of AIDS and poverty and human relations were all powerful influences, and I felt my own person to be under threat of collapse. The disorder had reached into my very being. It was time to get out of this situation and fortunately I was allowed to go on a course for 10 months in Dublin. For others of you, there may have been a variety of experiences of disorder. It may have been a breakdown of marriage, which put everything in flux. It may have been work-related, with a huge impact on your financial situation. It may have been an illness or an accident which had or has dire consequences for your lifestyle. It may have been, in parallel with my own situation, some sort of psychological near collapse. It could have been a severe loss of faith or period of deep doubt. There are a host of ways that crises emerge in our lives. They are often unpredictable and they can simply floor us. Very often they are personal, even though they may affect many people. But sometimes they can have an effect on communities, on nations, and even on the world. Child abuse and the ICSA inquiry has had a profound effect upon several institutions, including our community, even the whole church. COVID-19 has had a global effect on every nation and put us all in a state of disorder. One meaning of the word crisis suggests that a decision needs to be made imminently, or it can mean an opportunity. On a religious level, it can be a wake-up call provided by God Himself to draw us into deeper faith, to help us grow up and mature, or turn us from a path to disaster. This last is rather ironic, since you may think the disaster has already arrived. But usually we are offered this opportunity to reflect and come to our senses. We are being asked to learn something from this situation, however cruel this may seem, and if we do not learn anything, we can expect another fall in the future. Our biblical sources and human experience suggest that these disordered periods, these crises, these falls, are necessary for us to move on and grow. In the Exultet, sung at Easter, we hear the phrase, "O necessary sin of Adam, which brought us so great a Redeemer." As these crises appear nearer to the end of our lives, there can be another danger, besides that of ignoring them. Erik Erikson, in his analysis of psychosocial stages of growth, says that the last stage of human development confronts us with the choice between integrity and despair. I'm sure many of us have met or know people in the last stage of life who have descended into despair. They are coasting or sliding towards the grave, and sometimes they are bitter as well. It's not a happy prospect. But the alternative is to actively choose integrity. And this involves a second journey, which is predominantly spiritual. It is a journey towards God and into God. We may have begun this journey early in life at our baptism. It may have faltered on the way or remained at a somewhat superficial level of mass attendance and yearly confession, but it has not reached the depth of relationship with God, which we call real prayer or contemplation. It is the realization that this is our calling for the second journey in life, which will constitute the bulk of reordering our life and moving into this third stage of the pattern. It requires a death, at least a death of the ego, which does not involve its total elimination, but makes it subject to the true and integrated self, which resides, according to Jung, in the unconscious. This discovery of our true self and the discovery of God's Spirit within us will be the subject matter of the third part of our reflection, which is called Reorder. Welcome back to our order, disorder and reorder. We complete the cycle of order, disorder and reorder by a measure of transformation. I say measure because there seem to be many of these cycles in our lives, and it's difficult to discern when the series is complete and we are totally transformed. The saints must be close to it, but the Church sometimes takes an inordinate amount of time to declare a person a saint, and this may indicate a measure of doubt as to whether the process is finished. The question for us in this talk is, how do we reorder? How are we transformed? I'd like to say at the start that we are not transformed by ourselves. It needs another agent, and this agent in Catholic Christian terms is the Holy Spirit. The Spirit has been our constant guide and companion throughout our lives. But we reach a level of humility after our experiences of disorder to realize and acknowledge the Spirit's presence. This is one reason that I feel that this journey, the second half of life journey, is a spiritual one. However, it's worth saying that there is plenty for us to do in preparation for this journey. We do not simply sit around waiting for it to happen. How do we prepare? The first thing I believe we should do is reflect and learn from the crash, whatever form it took. If we learn nothing, we will not move on. And the first thing to learn is that we, in some way or another, were part of the crash, the fall or the disorder. If the ego self has in some way been brought low, then in some way it was overinflated. If we can admit this, aware that this is a form of death to self, then we have started on the ladder of humility, which is a crucial step in our further growth. I remember several occasions when I had to learn a bit of humility in the monastery, especially in the early days. Very early on, I felt I had lost my faith, which was embarrassing for someone professing to be a religious. I had to admit this to a more senior monk who listened patiently to my doubts until I realized slowly that I needed to take responsibility for what I believed and not just depend on the authority of parents and priests. A second lesson was learned when I was doing too much, having returned from St. Anselmo, and had something of a breakdown based on an autoimmune reaction, which showed me I couldn't do everything. These were minor lessons which I heeded, but they did not bring me to a halt. The lessons I learned when I left Zimbabwe were so many and so complex, and some so personal that I will not bore you with the details. But I felt I had shifted to another level of consciousness. Although I came back to continue work at Ampleforth, I became aware deep down that things were different. I imagine some of you have been through that sort of experience. What may be common to all of us who feel on the other side of a disordered existence is that we have been through it rather than round, over, or under it, or are living in denial of it. The experience itself begins to change in us. You may recall that Jesus, after the resurrection, was not recognized so easily. A change had taken place in him and also in his disciples. From this lower place, we are led by the Spirit by diverse paths. My own path led me to greater self-knowledge through a series of retreats. I had to prepare for the hospitality department. Later, I was asked to be novice master, and that taught me more than perhaps I taught the novices. It was certainly a challenge to my own monastic life to help 3 young men to discern their own monastic vocations. Human development was never part of my novitiate studies, but it was now integral to the studies of 21st century novices. I found that this was part of spiritual development also, and that the Desert Fathers and Mothers of earlier centuries, though not having the language of psychology that we have, were often very wise discerners of the truth, in particular about themselves. One useful set of images used by Richard Rohr in his section on Reorder are the 3 domes, which he calls my story, our story, and the story. The smallest dome, containing my story, can be expanded through self-knowledge and expressing the truth about myself and trying to hold the paradox of my true self and my shadow self in balance. My shadow is all the aspects of myself which I have not developed, either for the sake of belonging to a specific culture or because they were contrary to a religious code, or because I was fearful of developing that side of myself. Our story is the next level of meaning and concerns the group or groups to which we belong. This is the necessary training ground for belonging, attaching, trusting, and loving. Sadly, some spend their whole lives defending the boundaries and glorifying their small group, school, church, company, ethnic group, or country. Finally, the story is the largest dome of meaning, the realm of universal meaning and the patterns that are always true in every culture. This level assures and insures the other 2. It holds them together in sacred meaning. In fact, we could say that the greater the opposites we can hold together, the greater soul we usually have. Biblical religion, at its best, honours and combines all 3 levels: personal journey as raw material, communal identity as school and training ground, and an encounter with true transcendence as the integration and gathering place for all the parts together. True transcendence frees us from the tyranny of I am and the idolatry of we are. Still, when all 3 are taken seriously, as the Bible does very well, we have a full life, fully human and fully divine. If we hope for societal reconstruction, it will come from people who can see reality at all 3 levels simultaneously, honouring the divine level and ultimately living inside of the great storyline. After a period of reflection, we'll return for a few minutes of conclusion. Welcome back, and we will now try and bring this to a conclusion. One common experience which will come to us all is the experience of death, which could be classed as the final cycle of order, disorder, and reorder for each of us. How long we can conclude that order reigns or disorder lasts will surely vary in every person's story and perception. What form reorder takes has only been hinted at and has been open to much speculation, depending on the era, the culture, and belief in spiritual realities. But if the cycle of order, disorder, and reorder is a pattern of life, we have already experienced a number of mini-deaths before the last appears on the horizon. One which we can all relate to was the mini-death of leaving Ampleforth for the last time, when we moved from the relative order of school life to the apparent disorder of the life of work, family, and personal development, before reorder began to take shape. And here we are now at the last of these cycles, as far as we know. In a recent webinar in which I took part, Eamon Duffy referred to death as the ultimate sacrament of alienation, where the absolute aloneness and desolation of the dying Christ on the cross is the revelation of the state of all humanity apart from grace. Going through that disorder, we discover the New Testament resurrection appearances and Pentecost itself are all concerned with the rebuilding of community in grace. In other words, if we accept and assimilate the life we have lived on earth as the order we leave behind, and then let go of it, if we accept and assimilate the dreadful disorder of alienation in death, then we break through into the light of communion with God and the blessed in faith, which would seem to be the reorder. If we are familiar with God in a relationship of prayer, and if we are familiar with some experience of communion with our fellow human beings, then we may even long for death, however intense and painful, so that we arrive in some expanded and beatific experience of communion. A few years ago, I attended the funeral of a friend whom I had met in South Africa, a nun of the Order of the Holy Paraclete called Sister Maureen, whose mother house was at Whitby. She had contracted cancer and had come home to Whitby to be with her sisters before she died. She wrote a most moving testament, which was full of thanksgiving for experiences in Africa, for relationships with African homeless people to bishops and clergy, from family and sisters and helpers in Africa to her community in Whitby. She gave thanks for all she had learnt and all whom she loved, and at the end she was ready to meet her God and all who had gone before her. I include a recording of this among the resources at the end. Thank you for listening and for taking part in this retreat. I look forward to seeing you in person next year, perhaps, when we no longer have to meet virtually. God bless you all.